Many times what's assumed impossible becomes possible. But strangely enough, the reverse can also be true. What's assumed possible can turn out to be impossible. And so it is with bias. The assumption that all bias can be eradicated turns out to be impossible any time a goal is set. On top of that, removing one form of bias tends to force other forms of bias to pop up. However, before showing why, let's look at the etymology of bias along with current uses of the word. A very early occurrence of the word bias comes from the 1520s, when it borrowed from the French word biais. You'll have to pardon my French. Biais meant either oblique or obliqueness. Textile workers used it to describe the line diagonal to the weave in a fabric. Even today, the bias in a fabric is the diagonal to the weft and the warp. Running across the width of a fabric are called the weft threads. The threads perpendicular to that run the length of the fabric, are called the warp threads. Fabric won't stretch much in the direction of the weft or the warp if the threads aren't stretchy. That's because you're pulling in the direction that the thread won't budge. However, it will be stretchy along the bias, since the threads provide the least resistance to stretching along that line. As a result, a tailor will consciously take advantage of the bias of the fabric if stretching is needed. This idea lends itself to today's common notion of bias. It's the thought of stretching away from the truth rather than standing firm with the truth. The next early usage of the word bias came from the game of bowls, or lawn bowling. In lawn bowling, the jack was the small white ball which was the target at the other end of the field. In the 1560s, players talked about the amount of bias in the balls they rolled on the lawn. They built bias into the balls intentionally. This lopsided weight in the balls caused them to roll in a curved path. The ball would approach the jack at an angle, similar to the bias of a cloth. It helped with their strategy of rolling their balls around their opponent's balls to get as close to the jack as possible. If we continue into the 1610s, we find bias starting to be used as a verb in the literal sense, meaning giving bias to or causing to incline to one side. In the 1620s, it started to move in usage from the literal to the figurative. In the 1660s, the word biased started being used as an adjective in reference to people. Rationalist philosophers such as Descartes believed that sensual experience was highly misleading and confusing when compared to the clarity and certainty of mathematical rationality. Robert Hooke, who designed early microscopes, cautioned scientists about using images in science. A prevailing thought of his time was that images divert and disturb the mind and sway it with partiality. He went along with that thought, suspecting that images create bias where mathematics don't. He didn't think math was as deceptive. Later discoveries showed that math wasn't so straightforward either. Math, too, could create illusions, such as with a misuse of statistics. In the field of statistics, bias refers to the tendency to consistently overestimate or consistently underestimate the value of a population parameter. For example, measuring the height of basketball players in a school and averaging them would overestimate the height of the school's average student. With regard to other uses of the term bias, synonyms for the word include prejudice, partiality, partisanship, favoritism, unfairness, one-sidedness, or to influence, to color, to sway, or to predispose. Hence, we can see that through just a few centuries, the word bias has expanded its application considerably. The meaning of the word bias has received so much attention that people now apply many adjectives to describe countless types of bias. We hear of selection bias, survivorship bias, social desirability bias, acquiescence bias, or availability bias. We learn of subcategories of bias. Selection bias, for example, is further broken down into terms like hospital patient bias, non-response bias, voluntary response bias, volunteer bias, undercoverage, or the healthy worker effect. Then we get hit with all sorts of unconscious biases, To bring unconscious bias to light, we learn about conformity bias, beauty bias, affinity bias, attribution bias, confirmation bias, the halo effect, the Horns effect, or the contrast effect. What's funny is how some people, in discussing unconscious bias, explain it by pointing to ideologies they disagree with as examples. Yet, some of these very same people actually believe that they themselves have escaped unconscious bias. They think that they would be conscious of their own unconscious bias. But if it's unconscious, then by definition you're blind to that class of bias that's in you as well. It's human nature that drives this phenomenon. It's hard for me to feel the brunt of my own harmful passions when I'm not the target of them. It's usually others who experience the bad results of my unfair behavior. But I do feel the brunt of their unfair behavior against me, since that's when I'm at the receiving end. My unfair behavior typically hurts them, but not me, while their unfair behavior hurts me, but not them. That's why I feel the brunt of their unconscious biases that they're oblivious to, and they feel the brunt of my unconscious biases that I'm oblivious to. We feel the pain of each other's biases, but experience no pain from our own. Hence, we get the observation from Supreme Court Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg, quote, "I think unconscious bias is one of the hardest things to get at," unquote. With that in mind, I will discuss why bias of some sort will always be an ingredient in many forms of observation and decision-making. It can't be eradicated.